Chapter 1. Beginnings. My blood boiling with rage, I walked into a bar and scanned the smoky room for my father, knowing he had to be here. Where else would he be when he was not at home or driving his gypsy cab? And there he was, just as I expected, sitting on a bar stool, leaning in close to a woman with dark hair in a tight blouse. He was smiling and laughing, and I knew thoughts of my mother were far from his mind. A movement across the room caught my eye. A man I'd never seen before glared at my father and clenched his fists. Even from this distance I could feel a thick vibe of jealousy and anger radiating from him. The strange man reached inside his coat, and in that moment I realized what he was about to do, what I had secretly wanted somebody to do for a long time: kill my father. 2 shots rang out, and as my father slumped to the wooden floor, the stranger crossed the room to pump the rest of the bullets in the barrel into his cold, vile heart. While my dad lay dying, the bullet holes still smoking, I stepped from behind the stranger and stared down at my father's face. His eyes grew wide, and as his soul's silver cord was snapping, I told him all he needed to do was show some love and concern for his wife and family. Just a little. Then his firstborn son would not have spent so many days and nights of his young life wishing his father was dead and finally seeing it come true. The last words he heard me say were, "I wish it had been me who pulled the trigger instead." The wail of a siren jarred me from sleep, and I sat bolt upright in bed, shaking in a cold sweat. A dream. It was only a dream. The same one I'd had over and over again since my father's murder the year I turned 13. I looked over at my brothers, snoring softly through the uproar of the South Bronx streets outside our dingy apartment window. The room was freezing as usual, but I was used to it. Unable to sleep, I crossed to the window and peered out. A couple of neighborhood thugs huddled over a trash can fire on the corner, and a second police car roared down the street, its sirens chasing after the first one that had awakened me from the cruel dream. How did I get here? I wondered. I was born in Puerto Rico but grew up in the Bronx as the oldest of 4 sons. From the Caribbean island of Puerto Rico, with its glorious sunshine, palm trees, warm breezes, and crystal waters, we moved to the harsh, cold streets of the South Bronx. As a child, I would fold my arms on an open windowsill on one of the upper floors of our apartment building and look out at the trash-cluttered sea of concrete, glass, and brick buildings. I had an artistic soul, even as a boy, but for miles into the horizon I saw no art or beauty. All I saw was an ocean of ugliness. Good heart by nature, I was a spirited child who did my best to help my mother and brothers out. I knew my mother loved me, and that was very important, but what I craved most was my father's approval and love. It was something every growing boy needed. I longed for a dad to participate in my life, to say he was proud of me and that he loved me. It was something I never got. Instead, my absentee father had countless women on the side, bar fights, and drunken rages. His insane exploits ensnared him and saddened us deeply. I felt seething resentment even at a young age. That he cheated us of a normal family's prosperity, blessings, and happiness. His careless, cruel behavior toward my mother and our family became more horrible with each passing year. I would go from being a kind boy to being a very angry one. As time went on, my feelings and outlook on the world festered with the bitterness I felt. Eventually my once kind heart Turned stone cold. The bittersweet Big Apple. My mother, Esther Martinez, was only a sweet 16-year-old when she married Eustaquio Ramirez in Santurce, Puerto Rico, and gave birth to me that same year in December 1963. The very next year she gave birth to my brother Julio. We stayed in Rio Piedras, Puerto Rico, for 1 year until my parents and both sides of their families came to the United States. Upon arriving in America, in rapid succession my brothers George and Eustaquio Jr. came along. But the challenges grew deeper. As I got older I realized our family had not been prepared for the realities of living in New York. This was supposed to be the start of a better life in the most promising city in the world. New York. Manhattan was the island that was so close, yet from where we lived in the South Bronx, it seemed a world away. It often felt like we were trapped in a time warp. We lived in an apartment prison with invisible bars that caged us in an endless, living nightmare. The reality in which we lived seemed like a bad dream. My father, who was supposed to take the lead, instead was constantly running out of the home and out of our lives. He was missing in action for most of our lives. But when he did park the gypsy cab he drove for a living, we'd hear his keys jingle in the lock and he'd swing the front door open to step back into our lives. "Poppy's home," one of my younger brothers would yell. My dad was a young and handsome man with piercing eyes and thick black hair. Within seconds, bustling in her house dress and ever-present apron, my mother would put away any anger because of his absence, and her heart would be taken in again just by the sight of him. He'd stroll into the kitchen for a bite to eat as though he had never left. "What's the matter with these sons of mine?" he complained to my mom, pointing his finger at us as we stood in the doorway between the tiny living room and the cramped kitchen. "They're good boys, Eustaquio." "What do you mean?" my mother said, stirring a pot of yellow rice on the stove. "If they were good boys they would ask for my blessing whenever they see me on the street. Like their cousins do," my father said. "Bendition, Tio," they always say, "but do my own sons ever ask me to bless them? No, all they ever want is $1 so they can go buy candy." He glared in my direction, assuming that as the oldest I spoke for all four of us boys. Bitterness and hatred churned in my heart. I knew that a reply of any kind was useless. And then my father would make his way to the living room, fall out on the sofa in a drunken stupor, and go to sleep. Often the next morning, although we were his own family, he seemed so detached, like his mind was elsewhere. It was as if he needed to be treated more like visiting royalty than a father, and we all tiptoed around and tried our best to please him and make him part of our lives. My mother probably wanted to tell him news of her last few days or weeks. My brothers and I were bursting to share our baseball victories or basketball stories or talk about what happened in or after school. Maybe mention some cool car we saw or some girl we had a crush on, or even share a funny joke we heard. But more often than not we just ate in relative silence, afraid to say much of anything. There seemed to be a gateless fence with barbed wire around him that we were afraid to scale, knowing we'd get cut. At other times it seemed more like a brick wall that we could never break through, where he kept his emotions walled in, never expressing any real joy or love for us. I never knew who my father really was and wondered if he even liked us, but I couldn't figure out why not. I saw other boys with their fathers going to the park, hitting a ball, playing catch, Talking about sports. Those fathers would talk enthusiastically with them, pat them on the back, and walk along with their sons, sharing a good laugh. I yearned for that kind of relationship, but no matter what I tried, he'd just push me away and call me stupid. Some words are shattering to a child, and stupid is certainly one of them. My father didn't seem to care that his dysfunction was so damaging. He seemed to go out of his way to discourage my brothers and me, to criticize us and talk to us in a condescending tone. We were never good enough to make him happy. And I swore I'd never be like him when I became a father and a man. I hated who he was, and I was even ashamed to tell others he was my dad. Every now and then I held out hope that he would look at me and it would spark a glimmer of affection. In that moment he'd remember the little boy he once was. Or he'd want me to look up to him as the man I would one day become, but he left no positive impressions. The picture was either distorted or ugly or strangely blank. He left no template for me to pour myself into, no image for me to model myself after. He frequently made promises, and like fools we let our hopes get high. "Hey, John," he would call from the sofa, a beer in his hand. "This weekend, once my shift is over, I'll take you and your brothers to Coney Island. What do you say to that, huh?" His smile looked so genuine I believed him. "Want to go to the amusement park? Obey your mother all week and we'll go do the rides on Saturday." But Saturday would come and my father was nowhere to be found. He had run out of our lives. Once again, to be missing for days or weeks on end. Mom was the backbone of the family. With 4 children at a very young age, it was difficult for her to do things and move around from place to place. Since my mother was poorly educated and had no work experience outside the home, we depended on public assistance, food stamps, and whatever help my mother could get. Everything ran out after only a week or two, but we tried to make the best of it. From time to time my father would give her $20 to buy food for the week. Even back then, that was not enough. But at times it was much worse than that. Once I walked into the kitchen and stopped cold, staring in amazement at the $5 he had left on the counter for food and other necessities. $5 for his wife and family of 4 growing boys. Even with my grade school math I knew that 5 people, 6 whenever he came back home, divided by $5, meant my dad had left less than $1 apiece for each of us to live on for the week. I also knew that even in the late 60s and early 70s that was no money. My mother used the basics: rice, beans, and potatoes to stretch everything. But even with her creative and good cooking, $5 was just a bad joke. What my father had left for us to survive on was more of an insult than a help. $5. You know that's not enough to feed a family, my mother pleaded, her brow creased with worry lines. Then maybe you should put the $5 in some water and stretch it, my father called back over his shoulder, a sneer on his face as he laughed at his joke. That was one of the many ways he humiliated my mother and controlled the family, by leaving us in lack. Where are you, God? Like so many others, my father was involved in espiritismo, spiritualism, and appealed to his gods in a darkened room with strange rituals, chanting, and candles. To him it was just a cultural thing. One afternoon toward dusk I walked down the hall of our apartment and heard my father chanting in the bedroom he shared with my mother. Tiptoeing to the door, I peeked through the crack and saw him before a makeshift altar glowing with candles. The sight of my father chanting to his favorite saint, whom he called San Lazzaro, Saint Lazarus, both frightened and fascinated me. He often sent me with $5 to the nearby Botanica, a potion store, to buy an orange candle and flowers for San Lazzaro, whom he probably loved more than his own kids. I could still hear his words throbbing in my mind, "Hurry and don't lose the money." I would run down the stairs like a bat out of hell, trying to catch my breath and running past the people sitting on the front stoop. I was on a mission, dashing through cars in heavy traffic, my hands tightly gripped on the money. As I ran into the Botanica, I hoped and prayed they would have what my dad sent me to buy. If they didn't, he would be disappointed and angry with me. Unlike many other Hispanic families, my family never went to the big Catholic church in our neighborhood, but I had seen the crucifixes and pictures of Jesus and heard people call him God. If he was God, why didn't he show up in my life? Why did he allow my brothers and me to hurt at the hands of our own father, not to mention the anguish my mother endured? I pushed the thoughts aside as quickly as they came. It was too painful to dwell on what the answer might be. One afternoon I went down the block to play in the schoolyard, but to my surprise I heard loud music emanating from it. Curious to see what all the commotion was about, I drew nearer and saw a large red tent with a church service going on underneath. Somebody was playing a keyboard, and a choir swayed at the back of the tent as they belted out songs about Jesus. For a while I stood at a distance, touched by the music and stirred up in my heart. I couldn't put my finger on it, but instinctively I knew something very special was going on in this place. While the choir sang, a man came around off the stage and touched people on the forehead randomly. Whenever he touched them, they fell to the ground onto their backs, as if going to sleep. They looked so peaceful lying there, and suddenly I wanted the same thing to happen to me. I felt a love there that was indescribable. As if on cue, the man leading the event started moving in my direction. My pulse quickened. One by one he touched people in the crowd near me, the closest one being a man standing right next to me. The man fell out on his back, and I could see the blessing on him, that something special I longed for too. I looked up expectantly, waiting for the minister to touch me, but he had passed me by, moving to another section of the crowd instead. I left that event feeling heartbroken, unwanted, and unloved. Why couldn't it be me they prayed for? Why couldn't it be me they touched? The answer that flickered through my mind: I guess God doesn't love me either. My father, my enemy. Most nights my father came home already roaring drunk and inflamed by rage. For no reason at all, or any feeble excuse, he would beat my mother. My brothers and I cowered in our rooms, trembling with fear. We were all just little boys, and I would bite my lip and beg God to make the screaming and hitting stop. One night the sound of my mother screaming pulled me out of a deep sleep. I leaped from the top bunk bed where I slept and stumbled down the hallway, my stomach churning in knots. As I approached the kitchen, the sound of shattering glass exploded in the air. My dad had come home drunk at 2 o'clock in the morning and demanded the meal my mother always had waiting for him. "You good-for-nothing woman. I don't know why I put up with you," he yelled, looking for something else to throw. My mother sobbed as she tried to serve him the dinner she spent all afternoon cooking. Suddenly a reheated meal of beans, rice, tomatoes, chicken, and plantains went airborne as he slammed his dinner plate against the wall. Eustaquio, no, my mother wailed. I watched my father's face. Her reaction flipped a switch in his drunken brain and unleashed a monster. He grabbed her by the hair and began to beat her mercilessly. At one point during his pounding, my mother, literally knocked out of her shoes by him, managed to break away and run barefoot in terror down the hall into their bedroom. She struggled to lock the door in a futile effort to escape him. He lunged after her and broke down the door, and her screams grew louder as the beating continued. Though I was still a young boy, I knew I had to rescue her. I bolted into the room and jumped on my dad's back to stop him from hurting my mother. He turned around, eyes blazing with fire, cursed me, and tore me off him with rough hands, throwing me violently across the room. I hit the floor hard in a broken heap, feeling physically and emotionally hurt, angry, and powerless as he continued to beat my mother. Finally, at 4 o'clock in the morning, his rage spent, my father passed out and the house returned to its now eerie quiet. Shaking with fear and anger, I crawled back into my bunk bed and tried to go to sleep. In just 3 hours I would have to wake up, get dressed, and go to school as if nothing had happened. I would have to show a brave face to the world, pretending that my home life was not the living hell it truly was. That night, as I examined my bruises and thought about the injuries my mother must have too, my hatred for my father grew stronger. It was that night I first wished my father was dead. I didn't realize it then, but one day my wish would come true.